This is Fisher Flying Products. I'm Dave Hurtner. Welcome to the nest. Please take the time to hit the subscribe button and click on the bell so you get notified when we post new videos. Hello everyone. Today on Fisher Flying Products we're going to go through the construction of a wing rib with you. I have worked to get some raw footage here and I've done a little overdub on it. Lionel put the wing rib together and we tried to show you how we do it. We put a timeline on it as well so that you can kind of get an idea that even though we're explaining this to you, we're making this rib in under 20 minutes. So it's have a look at it. You can see kind of how it all goes together. It's a kind of a rough video and I apologize for that, but we wanted to get it out to you. We are working on taking that footage and adding some more footage to actually make an instructional video that will be a little more professionally done. But anyway, that said, here it is. Have a good look and thanks for coming to our channel and so that we can share this stuff with you. First, we build a jig to hold the rib components in place as they are glued together. In the shop, we use a piece of plywood laid flat, and we staple small pieces of wood to it. The pattern of the rib is drawn on the plywood with each of the geodetic components assigned a separate number. In your workshop, you would take your plans and put them on the table and cover them in thick, clear plastic, and then staple blocks shown on the rib jig plan in place on the plans. Alternatively, you can put together a separate jig or jigs, as we have in the shop, and follow our methodology. In the shop, we do not use plastic. Instead, we use car wax that we apply to the jig, which will keep the epoxy from sticking to the jig. It works very well if you apply plastic to the plywood before you put the blocks on. We suggest that you build 3 or 4 of our jigs like the one shown so that you can do 3 or 4 ribs per night. It will speed the process up quite a bit. We suggest that you start making ribs as soon as you receive your kit. This is the most time-consuming portion of making the aircraft, and once you've got into a rhythm and you've got them all put together, it's a great sense of accomplishment. We suggest that you break manufacturing of your kit up into 2 different sections, where you work on the 2 or 3 ribs in the morning because they have to dry overnight, and then you work on the fuselage in the afternoon. That way you can be working on 2 different things at the same time and it'll go much more quickly. Prior to starting on manufacturing the actual ribs, we suggest that you take your geodetic and your plans and make all of the geodetic pieces that are just slightly longer than they need to be and put them into cups. These cups should be numbered corresponding to the individual geodetic pieces on the rib plan. This way you have everything all prepared ahead of time and ready to go for when you're assembling the ribs. By having all of the geodetic pieces pre-cut and in the cups, you also produce very uniform ribs because you're pulling them out in order and you're doing everything in a proper sequence. This makes you less prone to making mistakes. Cutting the geodetic parts out in bulk, as we will show you at the end of this video, doesn't compare to making each one specifically. Picking up the raw material, cutting the part out, shaping the part, fitting the part, and gluing the part is much less efficient compared to doing a whole bunch of them at the same time ahead of time and having them ready to glue in. Pre-manufacturing the geodetic can take 2 to 4 hours for the whole set of ribs, and you'll have everything all ready for assembly. So the first parts to be inserted into the jig are the upper and lower rib caps. Take the rib caps and set them on top of the blocks at this time. Determine which method you're going to use. Put the top one in first or the bottom one in first. Whatever you choose is fine, just make sure you do it the same every time. You don't have to worry about the wood being wet when you put it into the jig. The T88 epoxy that we use works well whether the wood is wet or not. You notice that the rib caps overlap at the aft portion of the rib at this time. When you put the bottom cap in, you will have to have it overlap the top cap at the aft end. Mark the excess with a pencil line. Starting with the top rib cap, insert it at the front of the jig, overhanging the front block. Carefully push it into place while slowly bending it. If you have material that is a little too stiff or it cracks, by all means take the wood and soak it in water for a period of time. This will make it pliable enough to fit into the jig. Repeat the process with the bottom rib cap and get both in place. Many of our rib designs are flat on the bottom, so in most cases the bottom rib cap is much easier to install. Take the lower piece after it's been marked to the saw and cut it just outside the line, and then check it. And then sand slightly until you get the perfect fit in the jig. When you get the lower rib cap in the jig and it is tightly fitted to the upper rib cap, make sure you push both caps down all the way onto the jig so that they're seated flat at the bottom. Now we're going to mix our T88 epoxy. In the shop, we use old pop cans turned over as small mixing bowls. They're easy to handle and they provide a vessel that's small enough and wide enough such that the epoxy doesn't kick off too fast and you're making just enough to be able to work effectively during its 20-minute working time. They're also recyclable. The working time for the T88 epoxy is between 20 and 30 minutes. After that time, the epoxy becomes too thick to soak into the fibers of the wood and therefore doesn't create a good bond. The T88 epoxy and hardener are mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio. We found a very simple method to make sure that we get a very close ratio mix, but not spending a lot of time pouring things out, measuring and weighing. Take the first bottle and squeeze about 10 even lines back and forth in the can bottom as you see in the video. Next, take the hardener and do the same. We found this method extremely reliable, easy to replicate, and consistent without the hassle of time-consuming weights and measures. Once you have both the epoxy and the hardener in the bottom of the pop can, take a small piece of off-cut Geodetic and mix it for 30 seconds to a minute until it's well mixed. Make sure you've scraped off every bit of the individual component parts of the epoxy. Ensure that everything in that can bottom is uniformly mixed. It is important to regularly put the bottles down beside each other to compare their levels. You will know very quickly if you are putting too much of one or the other into the mix, as the levels of the bottles won't be equal. Adjust the usage on subsequent mixes to bring the bottles back to equal levels. The first piece of geodetic that we install is the small wedge that goes between the two spar caps at the aft end. It's important that you pull the upper and lower spar caps apart and apply glue to the fitted face as well before inserting the wedge. Make sure the wedge is glued on both the narrow edge as well as the little bit on the flat sides and insert it into the grooves of the spar caps. In many cases, you'll see on the plans that there's a piece of geodetic at the very aft end. We prefer to use a piece of plywood wedge instead of the geodetic here, as it creates a stronger joint at the trailing edge of the rib. Push both caps down and make sure that they sit flat. Aside from this wedge at the aft end of the rib, work installing geodetic pieces from the nose to the trailing edge on all the ribs and do it consistently. Now we go to cup number 1 and pull one of the geodetic pieces out and check it against the plans. It's always good to make sure that the cups don't get mixed up. If the geodetic piece you pull from the cup is too long and bows at all after being inserted between the rib caps, you should trim it and sand it so that it fits flat without bowing. Apply the epoxy mixture to the end of the geodetic. It should create a little bulbous end. Apply a little bit to the sides, but not too far up. You don't want to apply too much epoxy to these components. It's not necessary. The extra glue adds weight to the aircraft, not strength. The next geodetic piece that we like to install is the vertical piece that is next to the front spar. The reason we do this is because it provides a reference point for the next crosswise piece that goes into the front bay. This piece is a little more challenging to install because you have to bend it into place. If you hear a crack during any kind of installation or any of the geodetic, turn that piece into your next epoxy stir stick. Wherever possible, when inserting the geodetic into the rib spar caps, you should install one end at a time, with the other end free in the open space. Then rotate it into place so that you're not having to bend the geodetic unnecessarily. This also ensures that the epoxy is not wiped off. Check each joint as you complete it to ensure that the geodetic is wetted at all contact points with the spar caps. There are 3 parts in the forward bay. The 2 cross pieces should be on the outside, the top and the bottom, and the vertical piece should be sandwiched between them. The center or vertical geodetic piece takes the vertical load and should not be bowed. You always apply epoxy between connection points on the geodetic, and it's always good to hold these together while they're curing with a clothespin. Once in place, make sure that you push the geodetic into its proper position. It's important to note the positions and size of the front and rear spars. If the parts are not installed in the jig properly with proper clearance for the front and rear spars, you will have a lot of trouble later on fitting the ribs onto the spars. The ribs have to slide down the entire length of the spar. Be aware that in some locations on the rib, a T-shaped geodetic piece is required. As you can see, it goes in like a T. There will be one piece that goes between the grooves and one piece that goes perpendicular to it. As you go along and pieces are glued in, you can hold them in place against the blocks with either clamps or clothespins. As you can see here, Leo puts in the vertical pieces before he puts in the cross pieces, as the vertical pieces create the datum points for the beginning and end points of the diagonal cross pieces. You can see that we're getting down to the end of the glue up here and how easy it is to clean out the bottom of the pop can. Now is the time to mix up a little bit more epoxy, and with our method you can vary how much you mix by just reducing the number of lines you place in the bottom of the pop can of each part of the epoxy. A final check of all the positions of all the geodetic pieces, and that you have everything vertical for all the vertical pieces, and you're complete. If you have more than one jig, gently remove the completed jig and start over with the new one. We're fortunate in our shop that we have multiples of the jigs. We routinely make 16 ribs in an 8-hour shift, with one person working at the job. The best way to remove the ribs from the jigs is with a wide, flat chisel. Carefully pry them up. There will be spots where they stick because the epoxy oozes out, but if you're careful, you can get them out without any damage. From there, you lay them on a flat surface and sand down any epoxy that has seeped into the faces of the spar caps. Be careful that you are removing only the epoxy. It is easy to sand the rib components away and ruin the part. Now we are going to explain how we make our geodetics in the shop. We have a preparation method that we use that allows us to make our rib geodetics very quickly. This method is one that you might consider in your own shop. We take a long geodetic strip and we cut out an individual shape to size. As you can see, we double check that we've got the right size compared to the groove depth of the rib caps on the jig. This part becomes our cutting template. We then take it over to the bandsaw and using the template, cut a stack of geodetic material, 5 to 15 pieces at a time, to the shape, but just slightly larger. This method will allow you to cut the geodetic components for all your ribs in just a few short hours. Thanks again for watching. We try hard to bring you interesting content each week. To help us out, please like and share our videos, and to receive the latest info from Fisher Flying Products, click the subscribe button and ring the bell. See you next time from the nest.